Okay, so what I'd like to do today in sharing with you what is American accreditation in higher education is talk a little bit about our higher education system, why our accreditation is the way it is, because this is a reflection of our higher education system. I'll describe the different types of accreditation, and then at the end, I'd like to give you some of my thoughts about foreign, non-American institutions undergoing the U.S. accreditation process. And I think that will lead us to a discussion as well. So let me just share with you what I do. I'm, as Ken pointed out, my official title is Regional Educational Advising Coordinator, which is a lot of words, so we usually just say Regional Director, for Education USA. And Education USA is a State Department, U.S. Department of State, supported network of educational advising centers. And we have about over 450 is the current count of educational advising centers in around 170 countries. And what our primary mission is to help inform students about study in the U.S. at higher education levels, whether it's degree or non-degree, bachelor's, master's, PhD, postdoc, summer courses, ESL, any kind of study in the U.S. So what we do is we provide accurate and current and comprehensive information about the full range of U.S. higher education institutions. Now, when we say this, the full range of U.S. institutions, what we mean is accredited institutions, because of course accreditation in the U.S. system, as in other systems, is the mark of quality. It's our quality assurance mechanism. So we work on behalf of and promote all accredited U.S. higher education institutions. Now, what we do also is we help U.S. universities that want to be active abroad. So we are a resource, and we provide information and materials and trainings to your counterparts in American universities who are responsible for internationalization of their university, who are responsible for international admissions, or, for example, for university partnerships and linkages. So we play kind of a connecting role between American higher education on the one side and international students who want to study in the U.S., and also foreign universities and governments. We are a program of the State Department, so it means we are our tagline is the official source of information on U.S. higher education. So we are supported by the U.S. Department of State. Our advising centers are located in embassies. For example, Beata Milewska and Majka Brzostek in Krakow handle Education USA here in the two Polish cities, and also in Fulbright commissions. So if you work with the Polish Fulbright Commission here in Warsaw, their staff is also trained to be Education USA advisors. So they're not only providing information about the Fulbright grants. You know, the Fulbright is our flagship scholarship program supported by the U.S. government, but let's face it, not everyone can get a Fulbright grant. So we also provide information about study in the U.S. to anyone else. So our Fulbright Commission colleagues do that as well. They are, along with the embassy and the consulate, the Fulbright Commission is also an Education USA advising center. So, down there you see I have the number 886,000 students studied in the U.S. last year, just to give you an idea of the scope of our work. That was about an 8% increase over the previous year, and fortunately we see the numbers of students going to the U.S. going up every year. That's a good thing. The U.S. hosts about 20% of the world's globally mobile students. It's estimated that there are somewhere a little bit under 4 million students who are globally mobile. The U.S. attracts the largest in number and the largest percentage. But it's quite different than it was, let's say, 10, 20 years ago, when the U.S. was the primary destination. We still are the number one choice for many, but of course, look at internationalization that's happened all over the world, and look at the interest in attracting foreign students. I see a study in Poland wherever I go at any international conference. So Poland, of course, is also a destination for international students and is trying to attract more, as many other countries are. So this is a very important topic that we are all engaged in international educational mobility. So that's when I talk about accreditation today, I just want to make sure you have these things in mind about that. This is also part of it, is our work, our collective work in internationalization at our universities. But just because it's important for you to understand how our education system developed, because how it functions today is a result of this. So our higher education system is quite old, 1636, which is shortly after the European settlement of the U.S., our first higher education institution was established. And can you guess what that is? Harvard. Of course, Harvard. So, since we want to represent all American institutions, we don't want to say that Harvard is number one, our number one university, but it is indeed the oldest, so we can say it is our first university. But the way that things worked back then was really, the way that American universities or higher education worked was not at all like our system looks today, of course. Since the U.S. was an English colony, our higher education institutions were founded on the English model and also on the college model, such as Oxford and Cambridge are famous for. And before our country became a country, these higher education institutions were really quite specific, and they really focused on law and theology. So these were, again, shaping the new leaders of our new country, our first educational institutions. In addition to Harvard, some of the other early ones were the College of William and Mary in Virginia, Yale University, University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, and Columbia University in New York City. So some of these universities, which you might have heard the term Ivy League, they also, a lot of them do stem from the colonial days before our independence. So of course, higher education was originally just for the elites of the country. Then the first big development came in 1862. During the Civil War, when President Lincoln oversaw the Morrill Act, which is basically that's the name of the Act of Congress, which established land grant universities. And the federal government, gave land to develop universities for each state to develop its own state university system. So that's the root of our public or our state university system, is to 1872. The first institution was, in fact, Kansas State University. Shortly after it was Iowa State University. So if you hear that name of an American university with state in the title, it's a result of this important legislation in 1862, the Morrill Act. And as you see, it was focused on agricultural and mechanical sciences. So, again, it had to do with nation building, what our country needed at that time, development in agriculture, in technology, transportation, and so on. Then, after that, we have, some other interesting institutions, women's colleges, colleges for African Americans as well, started in the mid to late 19th century. And then our current university system, the way it looks today, American research universities really started then in the late 19th century with Johns Hopkins University was the first one to adopt the the Humboldtian model that was well known in Germany and other parts of Europe. And that is a comprehensive university offering doctoral degrees and focusing on both teaching and research. So our university started doing that in the late 19th century. Johns Hopkins was the first. Yale was the first university to award a PhD in 1861, I believe. Then, after that, in 1909, we had the first community colleges established. Community colleges are two-year institutions, and basically they are meant to provide local communities with training. It's not quite vocational training, but it is very workforce and skills development related. So you see that was another part of the building block of our system. Now, in terms of massification, that didn't happen until after World War II. At the end of the war, which was 1944, actually, Congress passed something called the GI Bill. GI is General Infantryman, so for soldiers who were returning from World War II, and to give them education, to give them access to education. So this bill ran until 1956, and by that time, almost 8 million former servicemen were given a higher education at the cost of the U.S. government. So during that period is when really we saw the massification. And this grew, of course, to nowadays we have around 21 million students enrolled in American higher education. So that's quite a big number of people. So I'll show you this just briefly. Again, we have around 4,700 degree-granting accredited institutions, around 21 million students. We had, this is last year's data, we had 3.7 million degrees awarded last year by American universities. We have, as I mentioned, public and private universities. Public means they are in some degree supported by the state government and by the federal government. Also, the private institutions, they don't receive quite as much money, and they have a different governing structure. Well, 72% of our enrolled students are in public institutions. So you see that's where they are. Women as well outnumber men in our higher education system. And of course, American universities are some of the leaders in research and development around the world. So that was $65 billion spent on research in the U.S. at higher education institutions last year. All right. I don't want to go into this, but just so you know, our classification system, we have something called the Carnegie classification. It was established by the Carnegie Foundation. And if you need to know more about this, I have the website here, and this is kind of the classification system for our universities. For example, research-intensive universities are the ones that probably you know and cooperate with. Also, I have a nice chart, which is too hard for you to read here in the room, but I wanted to include it in your PowerPoint that you'll get. And this is just our education structure. You see, we have primary and secondary school up through from kindergarten through grade 12. And then after that, here's our tertiary university level. As you can see, we have the bachelor's degree generally takes 4 years, master's degrees 1 or 2 years, and doctoral degrees more than that. So if you know the Polish version of this, then you might be interested to compare it to the American version. All right. So the number one rule is that our higher education system is very decentralized, and it's very complex. We have no federal Ministry of Education, such as almost all other countries in the world do. We do have a Department of Education at the federal level, but in fact, they do very little to supervise higher education. They're mainly involved with primary and secondary level. So that's something rather odd for people outside the U.S. to understand, is this spirit of lack of national or federal government control or interference, some might say, in higher education. And this also results in the fact that a lot of what universities do and how they operate, including accreditation, is really self-regulated and voluntary on the part of the university. I think this does reflect American cultural values. American cultural values that highly respect independence, self-motivation, and doing what you need to do to achieve your goals, that is, of the individual. I would say the same goes when talking about our higher education system. That's what is expected of higher education institutions. So we have really a bottom-up system of governance and regulation rather than a top-down from the government. So just please keep that in mind as we talk about this today. So I did want to mention the fact that even though our federal government doesn't play a large role in governing education, state governments do. We have 50 states, plus the District of Columbia, Washington, D.C., and some overseas territories, and each of those has a Department of Education. Again, they're largely concerned with primary and secondary education, but they do play a role in the governance and the funding of state universities. They don't accredit. State governments do not have a role in accreditation. However, they are also in charge of professional licensing. So licensing people who work in certain professions, for example, in the medical fields, naturally. That's quite important, or in the legal field. So that does influence accreditation a bit, but really the states do control that professional licensing.